We monitor islands around the world and in terms of economic, social and environmental issues. And we have something like 100 indicators of how those islands are performing in those three disciplines. And what was clear from all of that work is that islands over the last 50 years have gone through a life cycle, an economic and social life cycle. And what we're now trying to do is to put islands on that life cycle where they are at this very moment in time. And today I would like to tell you the sort of criteria that we use for that modeling. If the circle behind you very much illustrates the four segments that we are working to, if I could start in the top left-hand corner in the build process, islands. Many islands are in the process of developing, succeeding, very good results, and are building their economies, building their social infrastructures, maybe perhaps not as wealthy as others, but have got a very dynamic process. Then islands tend to go into a sort of fine-tune stage. At that point, it's the maturity side, and then fortunately or unfortunately, some islands go into crisis, and I will talk quite a lot about that. And then out of crisis, islands then reinvent themselves because they adopt new policies and strategies, take control of the situation, and start building once again. If I could just go back 30 years, because we go back 30 years in our data and information, Guernsey has gone through a life cycle, and at the end, I'll point out where Guernsey will sit on that cycle for debate later on. But very much, if we go back to 1981, Guernsey was in severe crisis with 1,500 people unemployed, horticulture declined, tourism was waning because of the package holiday growth in the UK, so people weren't coming to Guernsey so much. There was no finance sector, and therefore there was a real problem. When I was working at the time for the States of Guernsey, there was a lot of grey hairs trying to work out what would happen. And unfortunately for the island, certainly the finance industry's growth, for lots of reasons, helped to stimulate the economy. And Guernsey's had a very good 30 years. So we'll come back to that at the end of my talk. So if I could start with the top left-hand corner, which islands are in that building phase at the moment? What information are we getting from those islands that are in that top left-hand quarter? Certainly their economies are growing, that's why they're building. There is very good investment in infrastructure, schools, education, health, airports, harbours, you name it. Strong growth in infrastructure, a lot of government money, private sector money being put into that process. Unemployment is reducing, and the islands themselves are trying to gain status in the world and are trying to build their reputation in terms of how they see themselves in the future. And above all, there's very fast decision-making. Because they're in that build process, they have to take decisions which are very, very important, and those decisions have to be undertaken very quickly. Examples, Gibraltar. Their economy has steadily grown, even though they've had problems with the Spanish authorities over the last year or so. Their growth per capita has grown on average by 10% per annum for the last 5 years, despite the economic recession and downturn. Very good example of Ireland trying to take the initiative and working within the constraints and the threats and the weaknesses that they might have at the time. Another island which is a feature in that building segment is Singapore, where again, we've tried to take 2008 as a good benchmark because islands have either gone through very well the economic crisis or haven't fared so well. But in Singapore, the numbers employed are up by 18%. Jobs in construction industry up by a third, so there's a lot of infrastructure improvements. And the service industry jobs are up by a quarter. So again, one of those islands that are really pushing along and getting themselves together. There are threats to Singapore, and therefore in the future, their economic cycle and social life cycle will obviously change. China is their biggest threat because China are looking at replicating a lot of the things that Singapore are doing, but they're replicating it near Shanghai, and therefore a lot of the things that Singapore is benefiting from may be suffering later on, but that's all part of that life cycle. This shows you the infrastructure investment, and it's nearly a quarter of government spend each year from 2008 to 2014. Guernsey is spending less than that by far. It's about 2 to 3% of GDP, while Singapore is nearly on double the GDP rate for that area of spend. Going on to the fine-tuning stage, i.e. the maturity stage of an island, which Singapore will go through in a period of time, that fine-tune phase is when perhaps apathy creeps in, because it's been quite good, good set of economic data going through for many years. Therefore, there's less incentive to innovate and change. So people become complacent, is the right word. Acceptance of the status quo, trying to do things less frequently, but things are all right, everything is comfortable. A sort of a maintenance mindset creeps in, and there's a temptation to reap the benefits of past decisions, i.e. we did things very well, therefore we must have got it right. So that's the dangerous stage, and that's where Guernsey fits in. It's reached, if you come back to what I said at the start, the life cycle, Guernsey's life cycle of 30 years has been very, very good. It's a long life cycle. Many islands are much shorter than that. And apart from the early 90s, when there was a little bit of a blip for Guernsey's life cycle, so that's from the crisis area of early 80s, it's gone through all of that process. And things down need to be looked at, because if decisions are not taken, then quite quickly the crisis stage will loom up. So again, when we show some of the examples of the crisis islands, you'll see why. But complacency or lack of change, this very much depends on the finance sector, and a lot of decisions are taken on the success or continuing success of the finance sector. And over nearly a 10-year period, not much has changed. All those segments are parts of the economy, and you can see very little has changed. We haven't named them all, but the manufacturing, health, you name it, retail is the blue, and that, unfortunately, is contracting. So you can see that Guernsey has got to take some decisions which are very much perhaps out of the comfort zone, because they haven't had to take those sort of decisions for many, many years. Another weakness, perhaps, is the government revenue, and a lot of things have been said about that recently. We drew attention to this a year ago, that Guernsey, when you look at other islands, is hugely dependent on direct revenue, i.e. income tax, 71%. And if that starts to decline because people are earning less or the income is not growing, therefore tax revenue won't grow. So it's a very important part of Guernsey's thinking process. Another island in that fine-tuning or the maturity stage is Singapore. But you can see they have a different issue. They've got very balanced economy. It's unbelievably balanced. Therefore, they haven't got the problem of one particular sector dominating. But they are now having to rethink how or what of those economic sectors and employment sectors they need now to nurture and develop. Now we come on to the crisis stage, where there is a sudden loss of markets, i.e. some of the industries start to lose business, businesses do collapse, there's a widening government deficit in terms of income and expenditure, high unemployment, a decrease in the economy, and uncertainty for the future. And one example is Bermuda, which was in that fine-tuning and maturity stage up until the middle of the last decade. And unfortunately, Bermuda is in crisis at the moment. Government debt, because they can't balance the books, has increased, has steadily increased, and it's now nearly 40% of GDP. A very good example of how quickly crisis can loom up. And that's their debt at the moment. And in the last year, it's a budget which was released very short time ago, seen a sharp growth in that debt to GDP ratio. The number of jobs has fallen by 12%. GDP is down by 10%. Some very stark figures. So what is Bermuda doing? It's trying to get into that reinvention stage and very much looking at how it can not rely on its finance sector anymore. It's got, and Luke I know is here, but one of the best tourism strategies in any island in the world has just been launched a year or so ago. So it's looking at other economic sectors, how can it get out of the situation that it's now facing. Another island in crisis is Cypress. A dramatic increase in unemployment. Their banking crisis this time last year, has certainly impacted, and they are now having to cut back severely on public expenditure and services. The one good thing, again, like any island, how does it reinvent itself? Natural gas has been discovered off Cyprus, so there is a chance that other sectors or other industries could start to replace what has been lost. We come on to the final quarter, which is the reinvention phase, where islands are saying, right, we've got to get out of our crisis situation. How do we now reinvent what we had once before? And that's where innovation, economic diversification, a sense of urgency to improve starts to creep in. And very much the examples I'll show you where islands have reverted to their internal skills and talents, i.e. what does that island do really well and has done historically very well, and perhaps that's what they need to be looking at. And islands who are now reinventing themselves, Cayman Islands went through the crisis stage about 3 or 4 years ago and are now pulling themselves out of that crisis stage, partly by the intervention of the British government, which says enough's enough, do not borrow any more, while no one has told that to Bermuda yet. So they put their house in order, and they're trying to change their emphasis of the economy. So financial services are down because of all the regulation and other things that are going on, but certainly their business services are increasing, so they're looking at what talents they have within the finance sector and transferring them to other areas. Another example, and I use this one as the most classical example that we've got at the moment out of our 100 islands. Iceland, again, had a banking crisis in 2008. It really, really struggled because that part of the economy, which was its strongest, declined rapidly. And you can see their fiscal balance and how that changed 2007 and 8. And gradually, though, they're reinventing themselves. They've gone back to basics. They've gone back to tourism. They've gone back to agriculture and fishing. So they're trying to now diversify, but also they're looking at their own community and what that can, how the community itself can help. And it's a real success story. So reinvention has already occurred. Their GDP is growing by 3% per annum at the moment, and their unemployment rate shot up to 8% at the last decade, but now has declined down to about 4 or 5%. If I take Bermuda's example of crisis, their unemployment rate currently is at 8%. So they're an 8% of a population, which is the same as Guernsey's, means that Guernsey could have something in the order of 2,000 to 3,000 people unemployed. That's what Bermuda is now going through. So it's a sort of issues that have got to be addressed, and we have to be very aware of that life cycle. So going back to that cycle, where does Guernsey fit in? All of those islands, and at the moment this year we're going to be launching or illustrating where 30 of our 100 islands are on that cycle. But Guernsey very much is just there. And Jersey is not too dissimilar. And what will happen is whether Guernsey can not go through that bit and it can reinvent itself and trying to avoid this bit using examples such as Iceland and other examples of islands that have gone through this terrible 4 or 5, 6 years and are already in this quartile. And that's my 15 minutes. Thank you.